Hello and welcome to MHQ's Foundation 101 webcast. In fact, a mini-series this time where I have the pleasure of welcoming Nicole Buncher. Nicole, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you doing?
If you knew, fantastic. Every time I have you, and here is for a triple pod, so 3 times happy.
Great.
We know each other for a decade plus. You work private client, Middle East and abroad, and we thought it would be interesting to look, given the increased use of Middle Eastern linked fiduciary structure, to look at preventing dispute and whether it's better to use local structure, foreign structure, what needs to be done to prevent dispute, to mitigate conflict, etc. You're a specialist in that. You're a dispute lawyer, so perfect. I have the lady for the job. Ready to go?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, as we were talking previously, from my perspective as a specialist contentious lawyer, I tend to see these sorts of structures and these sorts of issues when things have all gone wrong.
Yep.
And most of the disputes could probably have been avoided if the right questions were asked at the start. So I thought we could focus on what advisors should be thinking about early on, how to identify the potential friction points, and how to document discussions in a way that builds trust and hopefully prevents misunderstandings a bit later on.
Well, so that's a perfect segue to what I think, and I think you agree, is one of the first topic. When we use structures, I believe, like you do, that culture plays an important role. Can you maybe talk about this, about expectation of various people and how they can diverge?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is actually a really good topic that advisors really ought to be approaching quite deliberately. So if we just sort of take it back to kind of basics, in Western common law systems,
Yep,
wealth is generally regarded as personal. It's
yep,
something that the individual owns and they will decide how they want to distribute it and how they want to sort of deal with it. But in many Middle Eastern families, wealth is seen more as a collective. It's
yep.
part of the family identity. It's not just their personal property. And there's usually an expectation that that wealth is going to be used to support the family. And by that, I mean the wider family. So the elders, it's going to be used to educate the younger generation. And also it's going to help protect the family's reputation. So when those assets are moved into a foundation, for
Yep.
example, sometimes a founder might not realize that they're formalizing what used to be actually quite informal, and they're
Yep.
turning a moral authority into legal governance. And if that change isn't really explained, it can feel a little bit like a loss of control.
So it's our job as advisors and various gatekeepers around to ask the right question, create awareness around these cultural dynamics at the outset, right?
Exactly. Advisors should really be
Yep.
asking, sort of initially, how does the family actually view ownership? Is it
Yep.
viewed as a collective or is it an individual's assets? Who
Yep.
is expected to lead and make decisions? And how do those expectations actually translate into the foundation's governance? If those questions aren't addressed early on, then the structure might comply with the law, but clash with the family values. And that's often where I see disputes having originated.
So what you mean to say is even a perfect structure, foundation, trust, PTC, PTFs, but with culture that is misaligned can create friction, yes?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The design has to reflect the family's own values. It has to build legitimacy into the charter and bylaws by discussing like control changes before the documents are finalized.
So we operate in a region of the world where religious belief play an important role in how people behave, interact with each other. So talk to me about these religious and civil laws overlays that we have in the UAE in particular.
Yeah, absolutely, because these are pretty common flashpoints later on if they're
Yep.
not discussed up front. So just sort of like here, we've obviously got Sharia law,
Hmm.
where inheritance tends to follow fixed shares with sons, daughters, spouses, parents all having prescribed entitlements. And
Yep.
so a foundation can be structured to either reflect those rules or to depart from them. For
Yep.
example, if the founder or the family as a whole might want to achieve equal treatment between children, or maybe to prioritize long-term stewardship. Either approach is totally valid, provided the family makes that decision consciously and they understand the implication. So advisors should also note, for example, that Sharia can recognize lifetime gifts,
Yes.
and those are flexible, and once completed correctly, they usually sit outside the inheritance regime. And so they can be quite a useful way to achieve planning goals within a religiously familiar framework.
So the so-called hiba, lifetime gift.
Exactly.
So contrast and compare that, the flexibility you have in the Muslim world in terms of lifetime planning and how to plan post-mortem for something that would have pre-structures versus the civil law system that has forced heirship, not everywhere, but in most jurisdictions.
Yeah, so places like France, Italy, and Switzerland, for example, have sort of forced heirship regimes which protect children and spouses with reserved shares, and they typically can include clawback provisions. So that basically means that gifts that might be made during the lifetime could be challenged if those sort of fixed reserve shares are reduced. So advisors really need to check whether the assets or even the heirs are exposed to those rules. And how these considerations apply is ultimately going to depend on the family's own circumstances. So their cultural and religious backgrounds, where they live, where they hold assets, and which legal systems might apply to them. And the point here is really not to frame this as a choice between complying with or departing from Sharia or forced heirship, but really just to make sure those issues are understood, they're discussed, and they're consciously addressed. So again, what I would be saying to advisors is really they should be asking like whether the potential inheritance frameworks that could apply to this family have been identified and explained, and whether the implications have been discussed with the family and ideally recorded in the planning file or the various governance documents. And if that awareness and documentation has been discussed and documented rather than sort of avoid or left to assumption, that really helps prevent the misunderstandings and any allegations of unfairness that might arise later on.
Very practical advice. I'm sure you have plenty more in your pocket. So what are the themes do you see repeatedly in dispute that advisor could have identified earlier and advised their clients?
So a big one is lack of clarity around the purpose of the structures that are being put in. So quite often you can find that founders don't really articulate what the structure is meant to achieve. For example, is it really being set up to preserve wealth? Is philanthropy a big goal? Are they wanting to protect their assets? Do they want to maintain control? And when no one agrees on the objective, or when no one's really clear on what it is, conflicts follow later down the line. So again, the recommendation really is to probe what the founder's real goal is, and how should the foundation adapt when major events occur, such as the death or marriage or succession of the founder or some of the beneficiaries, because that's often another real trigger point for disputes. And who's ultimately going to decide particular issues, and has that been documented in writing? Most of the disputes that I see come from this sort of ambiguity, not bad faith. And so a clear governance map and consistent communication throughout are going to be far more effective than complex drafting after the event.
So you mentioned communication a few times. Clearly, it's a big one. Communication, documentation, transparency. How can advisors put that into practice in your experience?
So encouraging structured dialogue. So bringing all the key family members into discussions early on while the relationships are good, explaining how control and benefit might change, and make sure those conversations are recorded. And that also gives everyone a real opportunity to sort of have their say and ask questions early. I mean, even something really simple like a family acknowledgement or some kind of statement of intent can make a huge difference later, especially if everyone has participated and feels like it's a document that's been collectively achieved. That shows that decisions are sort of transparent and fair. And so when advisors help families talk through those uncomfortable or difficult or sensitive topics, and when they do that early on, it dramatically reduces the chance of litigation down the road.
And that's really what we preach. I mean, when I was the chairman of STEP across the industry, but us at MHQ is ask this awkward question early, but in a nice way, in an inclusive way. That's probably the best recipe, is to have buy-in early on the concept and then to zoom in towards a potential solution where no one feel excluded and everyone has understood what it is about. Anything else on top of that we should put forth to close?
I guess the big thing is don't assume that silence means consent. So if you've got everyone in a room and talking them through issues, don't just assume because no one's asking any questions that they agree. I would say just probe and make sure that any inheritance expectations, control issues, fairness issues, if they haven't been raised or if no one's put their hand up, flag them, raise them, and be proactive in that, because I can guarantee they're going to resurface later, but probably in court. So yeah, good planning, basically anticipate the kind of tension, anticipate the kind of sore points, and try and resolve it while everyone's on good speaking terms.
So good to be proactive, good to have a binding agreement or a structure that has consolidated asset, but equally important to have to avoid cultural divergence, put it this way.
Exactly. If you sort of combine all of those elements, make sure everything's clear and transparent and everyone's respectful for each other, then foundations become not just like the protective tools, but instruments to really help create lasting family harmony.
So thank you very much, Nicole. That's a start. See you on the next episode. We will dig a little bit into the do's and don'ts. Thank you very much.